since the last video, I went ahead and buttoned up a couple things on this engine, and that includes reinstalling this passenger side header. Now, the next thing on the agenda is probably the thing that I've looked forward to the least, and I will be the first guy to tell you that I enjoy wiring. But when the previous owner, or whoever installed the engine in this, does something like this, I don't think it's going to be very enjoyable for me. Now, on the engine side, however, I did go ahead and save myself some time while the engine was out, and I built a whole standalone harness for this engine. As you can see, there's not very much to it. It's 6 wires for the entire engine harness. So I've got to take this mess of wiring and dumb it down into 6 pins that connect to the engine harness. But before we can do that, the first thing we need to do is get the battery mounted and run our battery connections for things like the alternator, the starter, the big stuff, and obviously a couple grounds. Here's the problem. I want this to be perfect. I want the wiring to look perfect. And without the battery mounted in the truck, it's hard to say exactly where the battery is going to sit and run the cable. So what the plan is to install this passenger side fender on here, since the battery tray mounts to the inside of this fender. That way we can install the battery and know that it's in the exact location it's going to be while we're running the wiring.
I ain't installing this big heavy fender on this square body by myself, so for this job we had to call in some backup. Meet Dilton and Dante. Yes, they're twins, and yes, one of them looks like Dora the Explorer at the moment with that haircut. But we all like doing cool shit around here, and I had to call in the favor to get them to help me mount this fender. After the fender was installed, I put a jack stand under the front half just to support it while the rod saddle is not on. Then we can go ahead and install the battery tray in its factory location. Just a couple bolts and some ugga-duggas, and that's installed. Now that the battery tray is installed, we can go ahead and lift the battery into the truck. Tighten up the battery hold down, which is just one bolt that clamps the battery to the battery tray. Make sure to give the battery a tug, make sure that it's secure. You don't want this thing rattling around on you while you're driving down the road.
All right, battery installed. Next step, positive battery terminal. From the factory, there wasn't very much special about the positive battery terminal on these trucks. They were simple, and they decided to keep it simple. But we're gonna do a little bit of a trick upgrade here. So this is a battery fuse box, I guess you could say. It does house the actual terminal itself, but it also has a bunch of connections coming out of it. And if we open up the lid here, you can see what those connections are for. I've had to do a little bit of modification to make everything fit because we did add a 400 amp main fuse, and that is going to be for the starter motor wire. But everything else in this box is factory. So we got a 70 amp, a 60 amp, and a 200 amp fuse in here. I'm not so worried about these two yet, but this 200 main fuse is going to be the wire that feeds the fuse box inside of the truck. Let's get this installed on the battery. I am super stoked on how that looks, and more importantly, how that is going to work to feed all of the things on this truck. And because I'm a cheap date, wine and dining at Chuck's Roadhouse, if you know, you know, I also picked up all of this for $5. And these cables are what we're going to use to bring the power from the battery and that battery junction box into the truck and to feed the alternator and starter on the engine. Let's strip them back, get rid of the broken tabs and split loom and things like that, and cut the crappy ends off of these so that we can put new ends on and attach them to the truck. So after all that, this is what we ended up with. This stuff on the bottom here looks to be all 4 AWG, and this stuff on the top looks to be about 2 AWG. The 4 gauge stuff we're gonna use for everything except for the starter, which we're gonna use the little bit bigger, heavier stuff for the starter. So the first main power wire that we're gonna run is the starter wire. And as you can see, the starter is tucked down behind the exhaust manifold. So we gotta go from that stud right there and come up to this battery main post. And I think how I have it, obviously we're gonna put a couple clamps on the way, but I think that's how I wanna run that wire. I went ahead and made the starter side of this cable. It's gonna be kind of hard to see where this goes, but I'm gonna install it on the starter now and we're gonna route this cable.
Now that we've decided on a rough route we want this cable to travel, something that I'm happy with, it's time to start drilling for riv nuts we're going to put in order to clamp this wire down along the way. So step 1 to installing riv nuts is to drill the hole. There's a sizing chart you can find. If you don't know what size hole to drill for the riv nut you're installing, you can usually find this information in the package of the riv nuts or the riv nut gun that you've purchased. There are also online tools to use. They give you sizing charts for what drill bit size to use for each riv nut you're installing. So after we've drilled the appropriate hole, the next step is to prime it, I like to say. I usually just use some sort of rust proofing or rocker guard or something like that and put it in the hole where the exposed metal from drilling is, and that way it doesn't rust in the future. And then the last step obviously is to install and squish down your riv nut. So after installing all of our riv nuts, it's time to start putting the clamps on and figuring out how exactly this is going to route, and that way we can go ahead and connect the 2 wires, the one coming from the fuse box, the one coming from the starter, and we know exactly what length we're going to need. After connecting the 2 wires together, I just like to use a open-ended bare butt connector for stuff like this. And then this entire wire is going to get some DR style heat shrink. This is just some stuff that I found on Amazon that I found to work pretty good. It's kind of difficult the way that this is rolled up, especially after it's been sitting for a while, and especially if it's cold in your workshop, to get the lume fully over a wire, especially a longer wire or smaller wires. But once it's on, it's really easy to shrink. Very durable coating, and it ultimately just looks nicer than most of these other heat shrinks or split loom or mesh loom, and it still allows the wire to be quite flexible, which will come in handy, you'll see later on when we build the next harness.
Next up, we got to run the main battery cable from this 200 mega fuse to the stud, which then connects and goes into the vehicle for the fuse box and some other accessories and things like that.
Time for some more riv nuts. This time we're going a little bit crazier. I want this wire that's going to be up and in everybody's face in the engine bay looking real nice. So we're going to go ahead and repeat the process that we did with the main starter wire, and we're going to drill and seal and riv nut all of these holes along the fender and firewall, making sure to drill in spots that we know our riv nut gun is going to fit. Next on the agenda, we're going to crimp the eyelet on the shortest section of wire. This is going to go to the junction on the firewall. And with that installed, we can install the clamps for this shorter section of wire and move on to installing the eyelet for the alternator power wire. These 2 wires are going to tee in with the main wire coming from the battery fuse box, and will ultimately be protected by the 200 amp mega fuse in parallel. We can go ahead and install the wire on the alternator stud. I'm using a 1-wire alternator, which means it's self-exciting, and this is the only wire that it needs in order to produce its amperage. 1 clamp goes along the inside of the passenger side valve cover, and then we're going to have to add 1 more riv nut along the firewall in order to secure this wire. I'm using an existing ground strap hole here on the firewall. We're going to drill it out, seal it, and riv nut that as well. Now we can remove the 200 amp lead off of the battery fuse box and crimp it to the longer portion or longest portion of this battery wire. can then reinstall it back in the wiring fuse box and install all of the clamps along the passenger side fender and firewall in order to get the exact length that we need for all 3 of these wires. I know this seems like a lot of work, but don't worry, we're not done yet. We still have to remove this once more later. So with all 3 wires installed and run in approximately the path that we want them to, we can go ahead and line all 3 of these wires up and cut them exactly where we need. And as I said earlier, now we've got to remove everything from the truck once again in order to finalize this main battery harness. And the first step is to tie all 3 of these wires together. So we're going to tee them in together, making note of which way each wire is going to run in order to make sure that there's going to be a smooth transition between the single wire to the split of the dual wires. After we have these wires connected, we can go ahead and electrical tape up the connection before we go ahead and add our DR style shrink wrap. Now, as I said earlier, you can see I struggle a little bit with the shrink wrap to get it exactly where I want to get it. And we do have to make a couple overlaps on this harness, but all in all, this stuff looks clean enough that you don't really even notice the transitions in it. We also had to cut the main power lead back off this harness in order to install this DR style shrink wrap, because although it would fit over the eyelet, that would have just made it 100 times harder to push it over and get it into position. Before we reattach the last section of this harness, we have to make sure that we slide on our shrink wrap in order to pull it back over once this is clamped together. As you can see, I like using a vise for doing these style butt connectors. It's just the best way to ensure that it's crimped really good, and it's going to make a good hold and a good connection for the years to come. And now we can go ahead and shrink the final bits of this sub harness and then add the small shrink tubes to the connections and make sure it's all looking real nice. Finally, we can reinstall it, hopefully for the last time, on the truck. And because I had to cut the main connection off and put it back on, which shortened the cable just slightly, I did have a little bit of trouble getting the cable onto the junction on the firewall. You can see that I struggled a little bit to give me enough room in order to connect that. I think after a while of it being on the truck, it will stretch a tiny bit in order to not put so much tension on that cable. But if we need to redo it in the future, it's not that big of a deal.
And about 3 hours of work later, we are officially done the main power wiring. Powering up the alternator, powering up the junction studs right there that go to the interior fuse box and a couple of other things. And then, of course, we ran the wire for the starter power. So the hot side's done. Now we got to work on the cold side main power wiring, aka the ground or the earth if you're from Europe. And you know how I said earlier that I was originally going to use some Volkswagen parts for the battery tray and the positive side fuse box? Well, we are going to use some Volkswagen parts for the negative side, and that's where this baby comes in. This is a ground strap off of a Volkswagen Mark IV chassis, and it just happens, if we put this on here, like so, when we come down here, it just happens that reaches perfectly. And then this guy, I'm gonna come down here and ground it right off of that, right there like that. So everything would work as is. The only problem is this bolt here is a 3/8 and this hole is a little bit smaller. So we are gonna have to modify this and drill this hole out to accept a 3/8 bolt, but that is light work. It's almost like it was meant to be.
First things first, we got to drill out the battery cable end. I went one drill bit size up from 3/8 just to give me a little bit of wiggle room when we install this bolt. Luckily, copper is really soft and super easy to drill through. Next, I'm going to take my grinder and just expose some bare metal on just the spots that these ground wires are going to be going onto on the frame and on the block. This just makes sure that the ground is a good ground and doesn't end up leaving you pulling your hair out once you go to get all the electronics hooked up and start the engine. And the final piece of the puzzle, we can go ahead and install this ground strap assembly. I can't say I ever thought I was going to be installing Volkswagen parts on my GMC, but here we are. We went ahead and put a little bit of the right stuff, which is just an RTV, on the bolt going into the block, just because it is a through hole to basically the oil pan, and we don't want any oil leaks on this freshly rebuilt motor. Then we can go ahead and finalize the installation. Just 2 bolts, one on the frame and one on the block.
And the last thing to put the cherry on top is installing this factory style cover for the alternator battery post. It's the small things, man. And just like that, the battery cable wiring is officially 100% complete. I think I'm gonna end this video off here, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for watching. We got a decent chunk done in this video. A lot of tedious work to make it look as good as it does now, but god damn did it turn out pretty freaking sweet. Stay tuned. In the next episode, we're dealing with this mess. So, if you like wiring and you like this episode, you're only gonna enjoy more of it in the next episode. So, thanks for watching, guys. We'll see you in the next one.